So today's the 4th of July, 2023. It's the Independence Day in the US. So congrats to you guys for getting your independence from the Brits back in what was that, 1776. Um, I don't, most of the time, I'm not into getting in too deeply into politics and kind of everyday affairs. But taking into account that it's Independence Day, you could say it is a celebration of liberal democracy to an extent. And by all metrics, the US is the number one global power in terms of economics, military influence. They've got the reserve currency and all of this. So, looking at the state of liberal democracy, which is actually the root of technological development, innovation, and accumulation of wealth globally, that started with market economy, the Enlightenment values, and the Industrial Revolution about 250 years ago in England. And the Industrial Revolution has created a humongous amount of wealth. It has provided lots of quality of life attributes globally, first in Western Europe, then in the US, and then elsewhere. Um, and what I find very sad nowadays, especially in the West, is the lack of appreciation of this revolutionary period of time where at the year 1804, the global population reached a billion people. And at 2023, we are past 8 billion. So in the last 200 years or so, we've basically created 85+% of the global population. Before this innovation and the industrial revolution and the better healthcare, etc., modern medicine, um, the world just couldn't produce and sustain more than a few 100 million people. And this is all due to development, due to freedom, due to um, property protections. And nowadays, when we look at the world, and again in the West predominantly, there's a widespread mainstream movement to hate on our countries, think that the West is bad. We were, responsible for slavery, oppression, all this patriarchy bullshit. Slavery is a universal characteristic of every single society through history. There's nothing unique about the West having slaves up until the British Empire was the first one globally who banned slavery, and the other Western countries followed, and then the other countries in the world followed. So kind of throwing shade at the West for this and that, or let's say colonialism, it's not a European or it's not an American invention. Every single society and civilization through history has colonized their neighboring countries, tribes, areas that they were more powerful than, right? So, for example, look at the Chinese history. They expanded because they could. Look at the Islamic expansion, 1500 years ago and thereafter. They expanded because they could. They didn't go to their neighboring countries and neighboring tribes and said, hey, we've got this nice ideology. Would you like to convert? No. They went there with their spears up and said, hey, we're here and we're calling the shots now. So when European countries, predominantly England and France, started colonizing the rest of the world, Asia and Africa, but obviously the Spanish and Portuguese, South America and Central America, this was only a very typical human projection of power. And just because it was this designated group that actually were capable of having that technological edge against the other societies, they could impose their will. That's the end of it. So our societies and our civilization that has created so much wealth, prosperity, and quality in terms of human life and reduced unnecessary suffering. Now we're supposed to hate on it? Now we're supposed to look at, past figures and innovators and pioneers and say, oh, they once did this, they had slaves, or they said something racist. It's like, that's ridiculous. Look at the other countries that are responsible for far less innovation and development through history, and they're still teaching their kids to be proud of their language, their culture, their society, their history, etc. So this kind of movement towards, I would call it wokeism, cancel culture, um, political correctness, I find that to be very likely it's driven by ulterior motives that nobody really talks about. And if somebody who's a conspiracy theorist, so to say, suggests that it might be this or that, everybody's like, oh no, that's bullshit. Like you're a cuckoo. But why would the most advanced societies globally and the best run societies globally suddenly start to implode and hate on themselves? It just doesn't make any sense. And then when you look at which societies are the most successful globally, we can look at lots of metrics. Um, Human Development Index, the subjective perception of people in said countries. How do they perceive? Are they in a good country or bad country? But the best indicator, which never lies, because ideologies can say this or that, is the flow of migration. When people vote with their feet, you don't have to listen to what they say. When they vote with their feet, you know what they value. They want a better life. Everybody wants a better life. You cannot blame a person for wanting a better life. But when they do, they always want to go somewhere where they have more opportunity of having said better life. And this has been studied extensively through the history of migration. The number one reason why people migrate is economic opportunity, to have a better life for themselves, their families, their close ones, their offspring. And when you look at the flows of migration right now, it is very clear. It goes from poor countries, dysfunctional, if you want to say bluntly, like just messed up, shithole countries, to the prosperous ones. Now, should we be hating on the countries that are dysfunctional? Not really. That's the wrong word. I would say these countries are dysfunctional for various different reasons. But there again, if you're more on the left side, you say, oh, it's because of colonialism, it's because of oppression, which is like, I will not take any accountability. That's it's ridiculous. But anyway, so when people vote with their feet, they always go to countries that are more prosperous. And that means predominant, if people had the choice, they would most likely go to North America or Western Europe, potentially also other countries. There's plenty of migration, let's say from Pakistan, India, Bangladesh to the Middle East. But given the opportunity, would they rather go to the West? I'm pretty sure they would, because the rights of migrant workers in the Middle East, the Gulf countries, it's not exactly great. With the one exception in the Middle East, which is Dubai, and due to their, let's say, taxation, property production protections, etc., they're attracting plenty of capital globally, and they've made plenty of investments into tourism, logistics, etc. So creating a let's say a public structure that attracts investment, sure, they are the one successful exception if you want to look at the Middle East. So Dubai is growing a lot. So the guys in UAE, they've done a great job, especially because Dubai doesn't have much oil or gas anymore. So they had to do something different. In places that have got plenty of oil or gas, whether it's Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, or Abu Dhabi, they've got plenty of natural resources. They don't have to per se attract investment and people and tourism that much. But going back to the original thought of this self-loathing ideology that's being perpetrated by the mainstream media in the West, and at the same time, the promotion of, let's say, degrowth, the climate hysteria, the fears of if we don't cut back on everything and we don't get poor, the globe is going to, life is going to end on this planet because of climate this, climate that. Now, climate has always been changing through history. There is no like end of climate change. It's always something is happening. It's a dynamic environment, right? Now, the question is how much is the human activities influencing climate change? That's debatable. But the mainstream media barely allows any, let's say, alternative views, such as Björn Lomborg, which is probably the most, let's say, decorated scientist in this field. Uh, but nobody in the mainstream media is ever interviewing Björn Lomborg because he doesn't go with the kind of gist, the time, go with the sign of the times. That's always like, oh, we should be afraid, afraid, afraid. Um, and because these policies that they're pushing through in the US and Western Europe um, that try to get people to be poorer and make sacrifices and invest crazy trillions into climate friendly investments. Now, reducing pollution is a great idea. I mean, ask the Indians. Out of the 20 most polluted cities in the world, it's like 18 or 17 are in India. That's really bad for human health, for everything. So reducing pollution, that's something that we should all strive for. But reducing CO2 emissions at what cost? It's stupid. CO2 is the prerequisite for nature to have plants, to grow plants. What you need sunlight, you need water, and you need CO2. And that's basically the fuel that plants need to grow. So higher CO2 levels globally means that there's more fuel for plants to grow. So the green biomass has actually in the last 20 years increased, not decreased. When did you ever hear that in the mainstream media? The global biomass in the last 20 years has essentially increased as a result of warming of the climate and higher CO2 emissions. So with all these policies that they try to push top down, what is the natural reaction? And this goes back to why the liberal democracy is really the best way to govern a society, is when you try to push an agenda top down, as long as you, even when the media is in on it, they're plotting, doing the same, giving the same message, people can still at some point say, hey man, don't like this. No, 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 no. And the good signs of that is look at, let's say, the elections in Italy, Sweden, Finland, Greece, Spain. All of these countries are going to the right? Becoming more conservative, voting for parties that say, hey, enough is enough. Our public finances are in the shitter, and now you try to push like, okay, we have to, reduce industry, we have to start taxing fuels more and more. I mean, this is crazy. And people say enough. We're not going to have conservation laws that basically ban, for example, the Dutch. You had these bans on fertilizers, and suddenly in the local elections, the hillbilly whatever, the farmers party, they just won a landslide. People said enough. These climate policies are bullshit. We don't want that anymore. So why I say liberal democracy is something we should fight for is whenever you go too far to the left, you get to places like North Korea, Venezuela, China, where you just basically create unnecessary suffering, poverty, and essentially bloodshed. When you go too far to the right, you can get to places like the Franco, Mussolini, Hitler, right? So then you get a very militaristic. Well, you could also say nowadays Russia is a fascist state. It's very rigid, very militaristic, and just controlling the population, not taking away their freedoms. But so the end result of both the far left and the far right is pretty much the same. People are stripped of their freedoms for whatever ideology, essentially meaning that the people in power want to have power. So I don't like having dialogue with these people on the fringes because they always strive for the same thing. Or let's say people who are very much into Islam and want to have an Islamic state or whatever. I mean, look at the states that are theocratic, Iran and Saudi Arabia, for example. I mean, without their natural resources, they'd be kind of shithole countries. Because when you run society based on, an illiterate dude from 1500 years ago, how is that going to work in 2023 and the 21st century? Like, for real. So the separation of state and church and separation of totalitarian ideologies from running a secular government, I think that's a great idea. And the one single advantage of a democratic society versus all others is we have a peaceful mechanism for the transfer of power. People can elect leaders that are completely retarded and they go overboard, but every 4 or 5 years, give or take, the people have the power to remove said leader from their position of power and replace it with somebody else. So that means that in let's say democratic societies, you can have completely retarded leaders now and again, but removing them in a peaceful manner, in a structured manner, is the advantage. If you don't have a democracy and you don't have strong institutions, these people will stay in power. Look at Putin. Look at Chavez. I mean, look at Hitler. They they got into power. Well, Putin didn't get into power democratically, but Chavez and Hitler got into power democratically. But then they wanted to dismantle institutions that could remove them from power. But how I foresee the future, the near future, is, and this is especially because I'm a European. In Europe, we're going to have a wave of elections, and people are going to be unhappy with this. Both this, let's dive into debt and let's get, joint debt in the EU, for example, and let's just spend money on unnecessary things. There's going to be a wave of people voting for the right that say, we don't want these overreaching climate policies. We want to have sound finances. We actually need to build our military capacities because we have a fascist dictator in Russia that wants to, basically control their neighborhood and deny people their freedoms. So that's something that we're going to see very much in the future. And I also hope that people are going to stand up against these woke retardum. That you have to cancel everybody that disagrees, everybody who's got a wrong opinion. You just have to get rid of them because they're bad people. And if you're righteous, then everybody should be more and more righteous. Otherwise, there's a risk of you being canceled, right? So the First Amendment in the US, which is the freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and then add to that freedom of religion, etc., that's something we should always be protecting. But nowadays, especially with the media giants, the online platforms, social media, they're canceling a lot of content that we should not be canceling. I mean, people who were living in the second part of the 20th century, um, especially after the fall of communism, they're just appalled by, okay, what the hell, what is going on here? And so, in conclusion, I think we should very much show more appreciation for the level of development and advancement of our societies in liberal democracies, so-called rich societies. We should appreciate our forefathers for allowing us to live in such a great country or great countries, civilizations, and we should not take it for granted. And all these fringe ideas, um, we have to be careful with them. Fortunately, the average person, whether they're educated or not, they still got that common sense saying, that's going too far, or that's not gonna go for that. And I think we're going too far to the left, too far towards the climate hysteria, so there's going to be a backlash. Obviously, the mainstream media is trying to fight it and trying to shame people for voting wrong, but you can't really replace the population, although some say that with a very pro-migration policies, that's essentially going to happen in a few generations. Is that good or not? I think migration in and of itself is not good or bad. I think it's necessary to allow a certain level of dynamism and flexibility. But if you have too high levels of migration, then you have the problem of lack of integration. And if you cannot integrate the migrants, you're going to have issues that you have in Paris right now. where people are rioting, they're destroying property, and they're for what? You know, for what really? How is rioting and looting going to change anything? So that says that something is wrong with in terms of integration, because these riots are predominantly, I'd say, organized, and the participants are from first, second, third generation migrant populations who feel deprived of, let's say, the goodies that these societies provide, but they haven't been able to reach. So yeah, I'd say like migration is good, but it has to be controlled, and it has to benefit both the immigrant and the society where the immigrant is coming to. So if it's uncontrolled, it's going to end in the shitter for sure. Um, so yeah, as a perhaps a sign of appreciation for the civilization that the West and the U.S. has built in the last 250 years. Happy 4th of July, and yeah, let's show some gratitude for the beautiful life that we've been able to create, and let's fight for it, and not bow down to any fringe ideologies. Peace.